people of the gospel. And the question I like to answer is, how do I convince others of the gospel? And it's a question I know that some of you have asked me, like, I know how to show them and I know how to talk to them about it, but how do I really convince them of it? And I think we have a good biblical answer for that. And to go ahead and give it away, I don't think the answer is some clever trick. I'm not going to try to give you this is the step-by-step way to convince someone. That's not this type of sermon. What I'm going to be talking about this morning is putting some trust into the gospel that it has the power to convince. That all I need to do is plant the seed and let the gospel do its course. Let the gospel do its job. So I go ahead and give it away right there what it is, but I'd like to kind of walk through us that. Number one of the reasons why I was thinking on these lines is because of something I was reading that Ed Harrell wrote. Ed Harrell was talking about in this article about a lot of the debates that happened in the early 20th century and the late 19th century. A lot of debates between members of the church and people that were either going institutional or other denominations. And if you read those debates, Ed Harrell made this observation. And he used the word legalist, but I'm going to use the word literal. I think it has a better impression. That the argument is that when you watch a debate and two people come together and they both believe that the Bible is the Word of God, or at least the authority of God, then when that debate happens, the literal interpretation always beats the liberal interpretation. He uses the word legal. The legalist interpretation always beats the liberal interpretation, and they always win the debate. The literal person does. Now, what he makes the observation of is just because that person wins the debate doesn't mean that everybody stops what they're doing and follows that person. And he brings up that's really interesting. Let me demonstrate that with something easy. Look at 1 Corinthians 16. 1 Corinthians 16, and all I'm going to do is read this part about the collection of the saints. Last year, I was in a discussion with someone that was just trying to make the argument to me that the collection did not have to happen on the first day of the week, that it could happen on any day as long as the same amount of money was being collected, it didn't matter. And that was their argument. Well, all I did was I took them to 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, and I just read them this verse. Let's read it together. Verse 1. Now concerning the collection of the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, so you also must do. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And then I read it to them, and they argued to me, well, but Andrew, you see the point I'm making is that as long as the same amount of money is being collected, by the end of the week, it's okay because there's no difference, right? There's the same thing. And you know what I did? I said, okay, now concerning the collections for the saints, I have given you orders to the church of Galatia, so you also must do. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside. And he's like, I know what the verse says. And he was like, but I'm still thinking that it's all right. Okay, now concerning the collection of the saints. Y'all can see the point I'm making. Why does the literalist always win the debate? It's because it's right there, right? All I have to do is believe what it says. All I have to do is do what it says. And there's nothing to be discussed about it. The literal interpretation always beats the liberal interpretation when we're coming to the scriptures. Now, ready? Does that mean that he just was like, oh, Andrew, you're right. Andrew, Paul's right here. Did I convince him? In that particular situation, I didn't convince him. But it continues to bother him to this day that passage is there. So there's a concept here that I might be able to impart knowledge. I might be able to show someone the literal meaning and say, this is what it says, this is what I do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're convinced of it, that they're convicted of it. They're going to stop what they're doing and practice what the Bible says. Look at Romans 14:14. I have it on the screen. This is Paul talking about how he knows that meat is no longer unclean, that Jesus has cleaned all meats and all meats are good for food. He says this in verse 14. He says, I know and am convinced by the Lord Jesus that there is nothing unclean of itself. I know there's a message here, but I'm not looking at the message. I'm looking at the way he says it. He says, I know and I am convinced. What is he saying? Not only do I have the knowledge that Jesus has cleaned all meats, but I also am convinced of it. I'm convicted of it. I would practice that. Does that make sense? He compares it to someone who considers things to be unclean. He says, well, to them it is unclean. And the thought is they may know that Acts 10 happened. They may know that Jesus cleaned all meats, but they're not convinced of it. So the buddy that I was talking to about 1 Corinthians 16, did he know what Paul said? Did he know what 1 Corinthians 16 said? Yeah, he did. He knew it. But was he convinced of it? Evidently not, right? So there's the issue. And I think a lot of us are having conversations with friends and family members, and we're reading them passages, we're showing passages to them, but they're not convinced of it. And we wonder, well, what am I supposed to do now? And that's why we're talking about that this morning. So how do I convince others? We're going to cover 4 different things, but these first 3, I think, are things that we put a lot of trust in that really don't help us that much. The first thing I want to talk about, how do I convince others? Some people have put in all their confidence in the convincing power of sermons. That they think, okay, good sermons, they will convince people and convince my family and friends of the gospel, and they'll obey Jesus Christ. Now, to think about sermons for a moment, let's go back to Acts in your mind and think about all the sermons that we have. And think about how many people were converted in those sermons. And I think if we put that together, it shows us something about the way sermons work. Our first sermon in the book of Acts is obviously Acts chapter 2. And how many people were converted from that sermon? You know, we have about 3,000. What's the next sermon in Acts? Acts chapter 3. And I'm assuming that 2,000, because he says, okay, and then there was 5,000 there at the end of Acts 3. We're not told how many, but that's what I'm assuming. So we have a big sermon in Acts 2, and it converts a lot of people. We have a big sermon in Acts 3, and it certainly helps convert some more people. But then our next sermon is in Acts 7, where Stephen preaches to the Sanhedrin. How many people did Stephen convert in that sermon? 0. He didn't convince a single person. Now, we can make an argument, we're going to make it later on, that he may have had an effect on Saul, who probably heard that sermon. But in the long run, I mean, they murdered him. He didn't convince anybody. 0. Our next sermon is in Acts 10, when Peter comes and he preaches to Cornelius' household. And there again, that's a success. All of Cornelius' household obeys the gospel. But then our next sermon is in Acts 17, probably Paul's famous sermon on Mars Hill, where we have those lines that we love quoting. How many people did he convert with that wonderful sermon? Well, at least 2. But he says, and Luke says, that it really wasn't a success. Most of them just shooed Paul away. It didn't have the impact that we thought it would. The next sermon in Acts is in Acts 21, Paul before the mob. How many people does Paul convert in that sermon? 0. And then again in Acts 26 before Agrippa. How many people does he convince and convert in that sermon? Again, 0. He almost got Agrippa, but it's a goose egg. When I look at all of this and just kind of look at the data in Acts and stand back, what does that tell me about sermons? Y'all, sermons are hit and miss, aren't they? You know, either they're extremely successful or they're not successful at all. Is the problem with the sermon here? You know, was Acts 7 just a bad sermon and that's why they weren't convinced of it? But Peter's sermon was a really good sermon. Is that what was going on here? No, Stephen's sermon's awesome, right? Acts 17, Paul's sermon's awesome. But they didn't convince anybody of it. So what's the issue? It's not the sermon, it's the hearers, right? Sermons in Acts only work for a special type of audience. If you think about for a moment and you're convinced or convicted that sermons are how we get our convincing power. I just need to come and break them, listen to a good sermon, and that good sermon will convince my friend of the gospel. The issue is that person already has to be a type of person for that to work. Meaning that someone who's going to be convinced by a sermon already has to have 2 things. One is that they are willing to come and listen to one. That they're actually willing to come into a building such as this one and sit down and listen to a sermon. That takes a lot of guts, that takes a lot of courage, and that takes a special type of person to be able to do that. And number 2, that person has to have the ability to actually listen to a sermon and comprehend what's going on. A lot of y'all are very good at listening to sermons, and you can comprehend what's going on, you can pay attention, you can make application in your mind. But that's not everybody. You have probably had to train that ability within yourself. I can sit down and listen to a sermon for a long time and listen. But is it because I'm just born that way or something? No, I've had to work for that. When I was a little kid, I didn't listen to sermons. I colored, or I took a nap on my grandmama's shoulder, right? You know, what did I have to do? Grandmama had to poke me, and granddaddy had to give me cough drops and try to keep me awake. And then when I got older, I had to train and force myself to pay attention. Now, over years and years of training and forcing myself to pay attention to a sermon, what can I do now? Well, now I can sit down and listen and comprehend a sermon. That's a trained ability that, frankly, not everybody has. Did these Jews have that ability? Yeah, they did. They could sit and listen to Peter's sermon and be convinced of it. Obviously, the 2,000 in chapter 3 could too. But, in Acts 17, were these Athenians trained to sit and listen to Paul's sermon? Evidently, they didn't think a lot of it. And so I'm not putting all my trust into sermons because I just simply don't think that it's kind of hit or miss. I think a lot of us put our trust into sermons because of early Alabama. A lot of us are grandchildren or great-grandchildren of people that were converted in tent meetings. You think about that at the end of the Civil War, preachers from Kansas would come down to Alabama and they'd have a tent meeting for 2 weeks and they'd convert the whole town. How were they able to do that? Well, if you think about Alabama in those days during Reconstruction, y'all, everybody was in the same boat. Everybody was poor, and everybody had nothing to do, so you might as well go listen to this preacher at a tent meeting. Do we live in that world today? Y'all, everybody in Alabama is a rocket engineer, and they got a Netflix account. Are we going to be able to have some tent meeting and have the success that we had 100 years ago in Alabama in the same place? No, it's hit or miss, isn't it? Those people were the type of people that would listen to a sermon. We don't live in that world anymore. Now, mostly our sermons are preaching to Christians, people that are already convicted at least of something. Are we still going to preach good, obey the gospel sermons? Of course we are, because that's what needs to be taught. But I'm not going to put all my hope and trust into, I'm just going to bring them to a good sermon because of what I see here in the book of Acts. Another thing that we put our convincing power into is something I call goodies. And I'll explain to you what I mean by this. Goodies is when a local church basically decides to become like a public brand, and they treat the local church like a business. And they're going to use those business wisdom things to do to convert and seek and save the lost. So for instance, they see a business do really well by pushing a logo, by printing out t-shirts, by making phone cases, by putting up commercials, that sort of thing, and they see their business be successful in that way with finding customers. So they just go, okay, well, let me pick up that, and I'll put it on top of the local church, and now the local church will be successful in the same manner. But does that work? A lot of people have put their faith into goodies. Let's make the local church a public brand. Let's push the logo. We have a logo. It's very helpful and useful. But what if we pushed it? What if we bought out a billboard out here and we just put our logo on top of it? Well, maybe that'll help. We'll think something like that. Let's make t-shirts and put our logo on our t-shirts. So I guess when you're in line at Six Flags, people will see your little Gardendale Church of Christ logo on your t-shirt. And maybe they'll talk to you about it. I don't know. We make our name a household name. I hear people say, well, I just want everybody in town to know the name of that church. And this is our church. And they know they can come to this church if they want to learn about the gospel. Some of those things are fine. Some of those things I think are questionable. Some of those things I think are wrong. But what I'm interested more in talking about right now is this the way to do it? Is this really going to help convince people of the gospel? I had a preacher that talked to me 2 years ago, and he was so proud of the phone cases he designed. And he kept on showing me how they had put their church logo on his phone case. And he was like, we were out there at the Magnolia Festival handing out our phone cases. I really think that this is going to bring some. And I'm just thinking, I think you're putting a lot of more hope into this than you should. I really don't think that our phone cases with our logo is going to convince and convert people to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because what are they going to learn from that? They're going to go, okay, Gardendale Church of Christ. Okay. I don't even know what to do with it, right? But they're trying to put the goodies and thinking the goodies are going to bring people in. But I've never really seen the goodies ever work. There's 2 reasons why I don't put my trust into goodies. The first reason And just to be very blunt and frank, of what my opinion is of what I've taught to other denominational preachers or other preachers belonging to our brotherhood or even institutional preachers, is that a lot of them sometimes are looking at Church of the Highlands and they want to mimic everything the Church of the Highlands is doing. Now, I look around this room, this local church hasn't lost anyone to the Church of the Highlands. But a lot of these other groups, whether denomination or not, they have lost a lot of people to the Church of the Highlands. And what do they think? Well, the Church of the Highlands has incredible graphic designers, and they have these incredible things going on, and they're making t-shirts and all this stuff. We need to do that, and if we do that, then those people will come back. But the fact of the reason why I don't think that's the answer is because if Church of the Highlands, or a group like Church of the Highlands, is making cookies and getting people to come in with cookies, there is no way we can bake cookies as good as Church of the Highlands. Does that make sense? That if Church of the Highlands or a group like that is pulling people in with cookies, they will make better cookies than we ever could. And so when people are out there that are looking for cookies, are they ever going to come to Gardendale Church of Christ? Are we going to have better cookies than a church with resources like that? We never will. They're over there playing soccer. We're over here playing baseball. You know, it's not even the same game. There is no way I could go over there and play soccer with them and win. I have to keep on playing a different game, and frankly, the game that I believe that the apostles taught us to play. This is my second reason why I think we should do it this way. Christianity in Acts flourished as an underground movement. It wasn't a public brand. It wasn't something you put on a t-shirt. It was something you whispered about. Look at Acts chapter 8 with me for a moment. Acts chapter 8. This is after Stephen's murdered. We have the line that Saul was consenting to his death and that Saul began persecuting people, Christians, and all the Christians were scattered from Judea and Samaria. We'll start in verse 3. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. That's the setting of Acts. Saul's out and about. He's going into houses, breaking down doors, dragging off Christians into prison. Verse 4, therefore those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. When Saul is hunting people down, as far as Damascus, do y'all think if we were running on the run for Saul, we would be printing off t-shirts with our logo on it? Do y'all see how that would be an issue? You know, do you think that these Christians that went out and they were scared of persecution and running for persecution, that they would go into a town and go, all right, let's plant a church. Let's print off t-shirts. Let's make phone cases. Let's put our name on a billboard. Let's say this is where we meet. Do you think that was going on? If they had done that, they would have all been rounded up and put into prison. What were they doing instead? Well, I imagine it was going something a little bit different like this. That they were meeting friends, family members, and saying, hey, have you ever heard about what happened to Jesus in Jerusalem? I've heard that name before, but I don't know anything about that. Well, if you got a moment, I'll tell you I was there. Okay. Then what do? You probably go get that person in a private area and you say, hey, I'll tell you the story of Jesus. I was there. This is what happened. And you share the gospel with that person. You continue to share the gospel with that person. Eventually, maybe that person becomes convinced and they want to be baptized. After they're baptized, what do? Well, guys, after they're baptized, you probably tell them the secret location of where you meet. They probably didn't even invite them to church until after they obeyed the gospel. It wouldn't have been wise to do so. To say, okay, now that we know you're legit, okay, hey, we meet here at this person's house at this time. Come and worship with us. It was an underground movement, and the word spread. It wasn't a public brand. It was something you whispered about. And that's what flourished in Acts. And that's why I personally don't think that goodies wouldn't convince people of anything, or it would convince the wrong type of person. What about tricks of the trade? Once I learn all the tricks of the trade, then I'll be able to go out and convince other people. I think some of us, we want quick-witted answers for every question. And once we get those quick-witted answers for every question, then we'll go out and we'll share the gospel with people. A lot of us are waiting for clever ways of explaining everything. And once we understand those clever ways of explaining everything, then we'll go share the gospel. Y'all have heard me and Jason, we'll have catchphrases that we'll use to explain something quickly. If you've ever studied with Jason, you know he keeps a ruler on his desk. And he'll bring out that ruler and be like, all right, now this is a standard, right? And he'll use the standard to explain the way that Christians look at the gospel, that it's a standard, it's a ruler. And we'll have little things like that. I think the issue, though, is that when we see other people do that, we are waiting to learn all those tricks, and then we're going to go share the gospel. That I just need to do all these clever things. We're going to wait until we've perfected all those little quips, and then we're prepared to go out and share the gospel. And I get it. You know, when I was 19 years old, I got to spend a lot of time with David Hartzell in Tuscaloosa. David had a lot of great one-liners, and he had a lot of good ways of saying things and giving information really quickly that made a lot of sense, that convicted and convinced people. You know, later I was with David Maxson. David Maxson's the same way. He's got his one-liners that he likes. He's got really clever ways of explaining things really quickly. And I'm in the position where I'm thinking, okay, once I get that caliber of quick-wittedness, then I'll go out and I'll share the gospel with people, because then I'll have all those one-liners. But the issue with that is if you're waiting, it's never going to happen. You will never get comfortable having conversations with people about Jesus until you do it. And I see that in Acts chapter 11. Those things come by doing, not by waiting. Look at Acts 11. Acts 11, this is where the church in Antioch begins. Verse 19, we're almost in the same story of chapter 8, about the scattering of the Christians. Look, verse 19 of Acts 11 says this. Now those who were scattered after the persecution that arose of Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, preaching the word to no one but to the Jews only. But some of them were men from Cyprus and Cyrene, who when they had came to Antioch spoke to the Hellenists, preaching the Lord Jesus. And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number believed and turned to the Lord. Then news of these things came to the ears of the church of Jerusalem, and they sent out Barnabas to go as far as Antioch. When he came, he had seen the grace of God. He was glad and encouraged them all with purpose of heart that they should continue with the Lord. When the Christians scattered abroad and ended up in Antioch, did they wait on Barnabas before they began teaching? Barnabas must have been a good teacher. I mean, the church of Jerusalem sends Barnabas to go help them. But did these Christians wait on Barnabas to get there? Did they wait on, Church of Jerusalem? Okay, the Church of Jerusalem will eventually send someone up here, and then we'll begin to start doing some good teaching. Actually, it says here that Barnabas in verse 23 just encouraged them to continue what they had already been doing. These were just regular old Christians that went to Antioch and started speaking to people about Jesus, and they began converting people. They didn't wait on Barnabas. It's sad to see some local churches that are just sitting around waiting for someone to come and start doing the work. Maybe if we get a preacher, then we'll be able to really start. And I know a preacher will help. I mean, believe me, I would advocate that a preacher can help. But that's not what the Christians did here. They went ahead and began. They went ahead and did the work that they were supposed to do. I was talking to Lee about this recently. Me and Lee went and studied with someone that asked us to come and study with their uncle. And as we were sitting there with their uncle, me and Lee were talking to him, and we had the conversation, we had the study, and then we left. And Lee brought up the point. He said, I noticed I kind of let you take the lead on that one because, I just expected, I just kind of leaned on you to handle it. And the conversation me and Lee had was, hey, if I wasn't there though, Lee, you would have controlled the conversation. If I wasn't there, you would have just done it because you were there and you wanted to do it. I noticed that about myself. When I was with David Hartzell, I never went and studied with David Hartzell, not like that, never mind. When I was with David Maxson, and we went and studied with someone like that, who did I just let lead the conversation? I let David lead the conversation because he knew all the clever one-liners and the clever ways of explaining things. So I leaned on him and I just tried to assist, right? When I was with Terry and we went to go study with someone, who did I lean on? I leaned on Terry and I let Terry handle the discussion and he controlled the conversation. But then one day what happened? Terry wasn't here. So guess who had to lead the conversation? I did. Guess when I started learning clever, quick ways to explain things? Once I didn't have anybody to lean on, and I just went out there and I did it. Did y'all learn how to ride a bike by watching somebody else? You know, can you imagine some kid looking at a bike going, okay, let me watch you. Okay, you do, okay. All right, now I got it. And they go jump on a bike and they go ride a bike perfectly. Did anybody learn how to ride a bike like that? How did you learn? You know, your daddy or your mama would sit you running with the bicycle. You know? Brethren, we just got to let other brethren put us on the bicycle and toss us. And once you sit and have a conversation about Jesus with someone, you'll start pedaling. And it becomes easier and easier every time because you learn this by doing, not by waiting. These people in Antioch learned by doing, not by waiting on Barnabas. Don't wait on Barnabas. Just do it. Now, number 4, how do I convince others? And I think this is the ticket. And you're going to notice it's extremely simple. By simply giving others a better understanding of the gospel. That's how you convince other people. You just got to sit down and explain it to them. You just got to sit down with them and point to a passage and say, well, this passage says this. This is why I believe this. That's how you give people a better understanding of the gospel. And that's how you convince people of the gospel. Instead of looking at all of our sermon in Acts, these are all of our dialogues in Acts. These are the conversations that people had. Philip and the eunuch, Jesus and Saul, or Ananias and Saul. Paul's conversation with Lydia and the jailer. Paul's discussion and study with the Bereans. When Paul knocked on the next door neighbor to the synagogue at Corinth and started the church at Corinth. Aquila and Priscilla pulling Apollos to the side, having a quiet conversation with Apollos about the gospel. And Paul's conversation with the 12 men in Ephesus. Every time we're showed a dialogue or a conversation in Acts, is it successful or is it unsuccessful? Every time it's successful. And it seems to me is the way it really worked. The way it worked really well is when dialogue and conversations were to be had, that's when people were successful of convincing others of the gospel. All these are conversations about Jesus and his gospel. I know this one's special because this isn't just a Christian having a conversation with Saul. This was, Jesus having a conversation with Saul. That's a little different. But that's how they were working. And that's how it works. And I think if we just did it and tried to have these conversations with people, then that's what would be successful. That's how we would convince other people of the gospel. Now, let me open this up and explain this in 2 different ways, and then the lesson will be yours. Talking about this concept, about convincing others just by giving people a better understanding of the gospel. Well, that means that I believe in the convincing power of Jesus. That means I'm not putting my trust in a goodie. I'm not putting my trust in some good sermon. I'm not putting my trust in some trick of the trade. I'm putting all my trust into that Jesus can convince people when his story is told. And that's what I'm putting my trust in. Look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 6. He's not talking about evangelism per se. He's talking about persecution. But he's saying, if you handle your persecutors the right way, you could possibly convert them. And he's saying it's because of Jesus' nature that you could possibly convert them. Look at verse 6. Peter says, therefore it is also contained in the scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect and precious, and he who believes on him will by no means be put to shame. Therefore, to you and to who believe, he is precious. But to those who are disobedient, the stone which the builders rejected had become the chief cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble, being disobedient to the word to which they were also appointed. And if I just jump to verse 12, he says, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. And he explains a little bit more about the suffering of Jesus. And then in chapter 3, we have the famous line, be ready to give a defense for the hope that is within you. Because again, you might open up a door of conversation about Jesus if you behave in this certain way. This is what I see here in chapter 2. Jesus has something about him that as soon as you know Jesus and you know his story, you are forced, by the gospel to make a decision. And those decision is very simple. When you're introduced with Jesus, your choice is either you can accept him, and Peter doesn't use the word reject him. What does he use? You can accept him or stumble on him, where you will continue to be bothered and to stumble and to fall on your face and stomp your toe on Jesus over and over and over and over again. And as years go by, you get the option again for those that are continuing to stumble. Your options are you can continue to stumble on him, or eventually, some people, you just give up and you just finally accept him. Because he bothers you. He annoys you. He's the stumbling stone. Peter says to us who believe he is precious. He's life. But to those who reject Jesus, he's a disease. He's a disease you just can't get away from. You can't purge. You can't do anything to forget about him. Some of y'all know this because you've already seen it. Have y'all met anybody that knows Jesus? Not ignorant of Jesus, they already know Jesus. And they either love him or they hate him. There's never any indifferent middle ground people. Either they love him or they hate him. Why is that? Because either you accept him or you stumble all over him. 4 years ago, me and Jason studied with a lady that we thought was very close to obeying the gospel. And about every year, she rejected it, but about every year she shows up and she wants to talk to us about it again. Why does she want to talk about it every year? Because she's stumbling all over him. She can't get him out of his mind, out of her mind. He's living there rent-free, just poking her. And it bothers her. These passages, they haunt her. Last year, I studied a study with a young man. And I thought I lost him. He kind of rejected it and he went back into the world. Just a couple of weeks ago, he contacted us and now he's got a study with Jason. Why is he back after a whole year and a half? Because for the past year and a half, he's been stumbling and tripping on what he knows about Jesus. And what is Jesus doing? Me and Jason aren't doing anything. What is Jesus doing? Jesus is sitting there and he's poking him. He's poking him. What's the word that he uses to Saul? He's goading him, right? He's stumbling all over him. What I've learned, and I think y'all have learned it too, is my job is just to give the knowledge. But it's Jesus' job to do the convincing. And Jesus will sit there and he'll poke somebody and they'll trip over Jesus over and over again. And they're going to have to come to a decision. Either they're going to hate Jesus or they're going to love Jesus. You can't shake them. You can't get rid of them. So here's our marching orders. These are the keys to dialogue. And I think I just have 3 attitude points. The first one is you got to love the Lord your God. Because if you really love God, you will talk about God. And if someone says in your office something bad about God, you'll correct them and show them what it really says about God. Someone who really loves God will force themselves into those conversations and make Jesus enter the room. The other thing you got to do is you got to love your neighbor as yourself. If you really love your neighbor, you will try to at least give them an opportunity to get to know Jesus. And sometimes that's just saying and finding a way to just say, hey, look, can I sit down with you and show you this chapter? Hey, you were talking about this the other day. Can I show you this to you? I just want you to know what I know. And go through something easy. Go through Acts 2, go through Mark 16, go through Mark 1. Show them something real easy. They'll have a question, try to give them an answer. If you don't have an answer, just say, hey, I'll talk to you about it next time. What did you just do by saying, hey, I'll talk to you about it next time? You just planned study number 2, didn't you? Very cleverly. There's your own trick of the trade. Now you can use that. That's yours. It's just very simple. I love my neighbor. I love God. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go to Antioch and I'm going to speak to the Hellenists, just like these people did in Acts 11. And finally, with our topic, you've got to be confident in the convincing power of Jesus Christ and his gospel. You don't have to turn there. We already talked about it. Acts 26:14. Paul's talking to King Agrippa, and he says, when Jesus appeared to him at the road, the first thing out of Jesus' mouth was, Saul, Saul, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. What was Jesus meaning by that? What Jesus meant was that he had been poking Paul. He had been goading Paul in a certain direction for years. And Jesus was telling Saul, Saul, I know you're kicking back against me, but it's hard. I'll just keep on goading you, Saul. What had been goading Saul for all those years? Was it not listening to Stephen's sermon? Was it not watching the murder of Stephen? Was it not having conversations with the people that he was dragging out of their houses? Was it not seeing their example and hearing their appeals to him as he was taking them off to prison? What were all those things doing? All of those things was Jesus goading Saul into a direction, and that direction was into his arms. And here at this moment, this is the moment that Saul just gives up, and he just accepts Jesus. It is hard to kick against the goads. When I have the confidence in Jesus that all I've got to do is start the conversation, all I got to do is present a message of the gospel, when I have that kind of confidence, all the weight has been lifted off my shoulders. Because I'm not having to do the heavy lifting. All I've got to do is get Jesus in there, and I know Jesus is going to do the heavy lifting. Now I have all the confidence in the world to talk to people about the gospel, because I know that they cannot resist Jesus. I come into every study now with the opinion that all I'm going to do is plant a seed, and that seed is going to change their life, no matter what. Now, it could change their life for the better, or it can change their life for the worst. That's their decision. But I am going to plant the seed and change their life. And when I have that attitude and all the confidence, not in goodies and not in tricks or not in sermons, not in anything like that, when I put all my trust in the convincing power of Jesus Christ, man, I've already won every time. And if we have that type of attitude, and these three attitudes especially, we'll create those dialogues and convince our family and friends about the gospel. Thank you for your close attention. If you're sitting in this building this morning, you already have the ability, probably, to come and listen to a sermon and be convinced by a sermon. If you're here, you probably do have that ability. Be convinced of Jesus Christ. The only thing that's probably holding you back is yourself. What I can guarantee you, though, is that if you continue to reject Jesus Christ, and you know him and you know what you have to do, I can guarantee you that you will never forget that Jesus will continue to bother you and to annoy you, and you will continue to stumble on Jesus until you just accept him. There's no reason to put yourself through any further mental punishment. All you got to do is accept what you already know to be true, which is that this is Jesus Christ, and we have life in his name. If there's anyone here that wants our assistance, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing?